Welcome to the Microsoft AZ-104 exam prep session for the Azure Administrator course. My name is Lanice Lancy, Microsoft Certified Trainer, and I'll be walking us through this review. Let's discuss the certification journey. This is our guide for where we'd like to focus our study before the exam itself. Each exam has an expected amount of skills to be measured, and you may have started with some pre-prep for the AZ-104. You have possibly optionally set for the AZ-900, which is a great place to start for Azure fundamental training. Maybe you have some hands-on experience that you've covered in at least 6 months or so, or maybe not. Maybe you've acquired some self-paced journey, some prerequisite training, and you're all ready to sit for the exam. This is where we will cover our objective domain areas. After watching this video, you will be able to identify what will be covered on the exam, determine which concepts to prioritize for study, and explain some of the or understand the formats for the questions that you may see, as well as locate additional resources to utilize. This course is all about preparing for the exam versus actually training, which you have probably already done yourself to cover concepts. We assume that you understand topics and concepts in this session. Now let's review what we will cover in the next set of modules in preparation for the exam prep. Here's what you'll need to know. The AZ-104 is weighted into these 5 skills or topics, which will be covered on the exam. These are called functional groups. Functional groups measure the skills needed or to master to be successful in completion of the AZ-104 certification. The following objective domains, starting with Group 1, managing Azure identities and governance is weighted up to 20%. Group 2, implementing and managing storage, weighted up to 20%. Group 3, deploying and managing Azure compute resources, up to 25%. Group 4, configuring and managing virtual networking, up to 30%. And Group 5, up to 15% to cover monitoring and backup of Azure resources. Important to note that the percentages that you see weighted in each group will correspond or correlate with the amount of exam questions that you will see per functional group. So there will be a relational value for objective domain, and the number of exam questions that you'll see. Let's get started with the first functional group area. Our first skills measured area, Manage Azure Identities and Governance, explores the following topics. 1.1, Manage Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Objects. 1.2, Managing Access Control. And 1.3, Managing Azure Subscriptions and Governance. Let's explore the first topic. Azure Active Directory is a hierarchical structure that stores information about objects on the network. Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's multi-tenant cloud-based directory and management service and allows you to either store objects within the cloud without any hybrid workloads or connect to your on-premises workloads and have identities mapped from on-premises to your tenant. Important to think about how to manage single sign-on and the distribution of features that would be available to you in the licensing model here, as well as a tool called AD Connect, which allows you to manage hybrid identities. So understand the components for either cloud only versus hybrid identities for the exam. Moving along to managing licenses, there are some key management features that are relevant to each license model. When you think about licensing plans and details, remember the following license plans and some of the key aspects which are included in that management to include total number of licenses purchased, assigned, and available, and those that might be expiring soon. How would you manage a license plan in Azure? Think about how you would assign licenses to either users or groups. Also, what would you need to do in steps, sequential order, to remove or modify a license from a user or group? These are things are as important aspects that you may want to consider before sitting for the AZ-104 exam. We can also think about managing groups of users in Azure administrative units, which allow you to use the portal or another option like maybe an automated approach to scoping your administrative permissions to restrict permissions in a role to any portion of your organization that you define. So knowing how to apply an administrative unit is very important. Where you can find administrative unit access relative to your licensing model is also key. For example, Azure ADP2 allows you privileged identity protection and access management, which is needed to manage additional features within Azure. Understanding the differences between the P2, P1 licenses, and the contrast of feature set would be important for the exam. You'll understand as if from your study and from your recent experience with Azure and managing identity that you also have options to manage device settings and device identity with modern device scenarios that focus on registered devices in Azure AD, joined devices, or hybrid identity devices. Understand the difference. Which one allows you to, for example, bring your own device and use an organization's resources on your personal device, maybe to manage things like compliance or maybe understanding as well which platforms would allow such a use case. We understand that to be Azure AD registered devices in that option, which you may see a question that asks, which of these identity management options allow you to, or any organization, to deploy Azure AD devices irrespective of the OS size in a hybrid environment, enabling access to both cloud and on-premises apps. We know this to be Azure AD joined devices. It would behoove you to understand the differences between these three models. Azure AD roles allow you to grant access to the tenant itself. Azure AD roles from our study, we remember that they allow particular users, groups, or domains to have access to our tenant, to our Azure environment. But within those roles, we have specific purposes, which are global administrator, user administrator, billing administrator in this example. We can see that Azure AD Tenant requires an Azure admin role. We'll talk about the contrast between Azure AD admin roles and Azure RBAC, role-based access control, in a bit, but important to understand that there are some key differences that allow you to manage permissions at various scopes and what those scopes are: tenant, root level, management, subscription, resource groups, and then the resource. So we would scope permissions at various levels. You may see a question that asks, which of the levels of scope allow you to apply global administrator rights to perform any action within identity management? We know this to be the global administrator access. We also have the ability to invite guests if we'd like to collaborate with other external vendors, contractors who have needs, and would like to use our resources that we manage in our Azure tenant. From our study, we understand that we can use the portal, Azure portal, to collaborate by inviting a guest user. What does that process look like? How would you invite a guest user? What are some of the restrictions to access that guest user would be limited to? What type of email address or account would that guest user need? And where do they live? That guest user does not live in our tenant. So understand the nuances between adding and managing a guest user versus inviting a new user, creating a new user in our existing environment that we manage, who has access to even hybrid identities. User management is what we've touched on so far. User management is the fastest way to create new users and groups, but we do have other options. For the AZ-104, it might be a good idea to explore other tools to add a user or group, like bulk bulk user upload or bulk group creation. What about custom users and groups? And maybe it's also a great idea to understand what typically defines users in Azure: cloud identities, directory synced identities, which exist on premises and are brought into Azure AD through synchronization. And that synchronization process, again, Azure AD Connect. These are all components that you may see on the exam. Also, thinking about creating administrative groups by adding a premium license, Premium 1 P2, Premium 1 P1, excuse me, or P2, which allow privileged role administrator, and you do need a special level of access to create administrative units and elevate your license permissions. Also great to know for the exam. Uploading bulk users allows you to take a comma separated values file, which is available either through the portal or through an automated approach like PowerShell or Azure CLI. You do need to sign in with Azure Global Administrator or User Administrator rights. So also important to remember for the exam that permissions span, again, scopes, and we'll scope permissions for the Azure Active Directory tenant or for our resources at the RBAC level. Let's talk about role-based access control. Role-based access control is going to allow you to manage Azure resources versus Azure identities. That's the largest contrast between Azure AD account role managements and permissions in the tenant and RBAC. RBAC allows authorization versus authentication for Azure managed resources with fine-grained control to manage those resources. So when we think about RBAC, know for the exam the concept of least privilege. Understand key concepts to include the differences between user, group, service principal, which we know to be something like a service account if we relate that to our on-premises, resource management or identity management, or managed identities. And understand the differences between how to scope each one of these permissions at what level: management group, subscription, resource group, or resource. Also, think about role definitions. We have some built-in roles versus an option to customize roles. A built-in role would allow which user types: reader, contributor, owner, which is a separate set of permissions from our Azure AD roles. A little bit more about scope. Scope allows us to define the level of permissions. At what hierarchical level do we want to apply the security principle, or that security principle will have access to? Is that going to be, again, management group, subscription level, resource group level, which is more a life cycle management tier for resources itself? We know the subscription level from the bottom up, but the subscription level allows us to manage billing, and the management group level allows us to apply policy to multiple subscriptions, which are placed in groups. Um, so it's very key to understand not just the permission, but where you're going to scope that permission. And you may see a question on the exam that asks about RBAC. Can you have RBAC at various tiers or RBAC scopes? And the answer is yes. I can have a reader right or permission at the resource level. I may have a owner permission or RBAC scope to the resource group level, which automatically inherits permissions at lower tiers as well. So you can segment access and delegate access to various resources and layer RBAC scope. A little bit more about RBAC. We understand that RBAC has Azure role-based access control roles that are built in to include owner, which allows full access to all resources, and you can also delegate access to others. Contributor, which only allows you to do all the things that owner can do except for granting access to others. And reader, which just allows you view permissions on resources. User administrator would give you the ability to just manage users, and that's a key difference. Some of these built-in roles can be customized to group some of these permissions together. And we also have the ability to use built-in roles per resource, such as VM reader or storage reader, for example, or storage contributor. So we do have the option to take advantage of built-in roles and target specific resources as well. If I'd like to view my access control, where do we go? We would go to the portal and search a specific resource scope, and then its access control interface, or AMI, which allows us to add, view, or check access for specific RBAC roles. Important to note, the things that you can modify with access control are going to be specific to the target scope you're working within. You may see a question that asks you if a given organization is presented with um, a user, maybe a lead role who has user access administrator permissions to a resource group, would they then be able to delete a subscription? This would be one of the types of questions you could possibly see on the exam. We know that that would be not the case because they would need either owner permissions to that subscription or some other higher level modifications like owner, or in some cases, in contributor would also be a good answer for that question at the subscription scope. Let's talk a little bit more about activity logs. We know activity logs allow us to view events, to gather information that would not be specific to metrics. There's a difference between logs and metrics that you should know for the exam. Metrics are numeric values, and logs are everything else that allow you to view activities on the users and groups and RBAC related operations that are performed at a specific scope. So understand how to create role assignments, delete role assignments, sure, but also know where to go to view those activities for audit and analysis, and that would be activity logs. Let's move on to subgroup 1.3, managing subscriptions and governance. Azure Governance allows us to apply several mechanisms to keep our resources organized, and some of those benefits include using the following groups to virtually organize all of those resources in a logical fashion. Resource groups are containers that hold related resources for Azure solutions. Management groups also allow us to target a specific scope. That scope is going to be subscriptions. Subscriptions give us a billing boundary that allows us to monitor cost management for all of the resources within a subscription. When we talk about governance, understand what you can and can't do with resource groups. Can you nest resource groups? True or false? That would be false. Can you rename resource groups? No, you can't, but you can create a new resource group. You can move resources across various regions and subscriptions. So understand those differences in preparation for the AZ-104. What about management groups? Management groups have a default management level, a scope of a management group that is assigned to your account. You don't have to use the management group, but we know that it's there if we would like to, and we can't remove it as default. It is a default fixture in Azure. We have options to create multiple subscriptions, and you can create RBAC aligned to multiple scopes. When you're managing subscriptions, you have options. You would need to understand that there are subscriptions that relate to your contractual obligation for your cloud agreements. An Azure Enterprise agreement would allow a specific type of a little bit more involved of a subscription for a small to medium business, but there are other types to include CSP, for example, cloud solution providers. Um, so you may have a question that asks, if you are a part of an organization with a specific CSP subscription, are you allowed to convert that to an enterprise agreement subscription? Know those differences. Know that you can also use tags to manage subscriptions, management groups to manage subscriptions, and that there are several layers of depth to how you scope management groups for easier access, uh, for cost management, for environmental management, um, and understand the following. Paying invoices. Subscriptions do allow you to view your invoices on a monthly basis. Who can create subscriptions? That would be an RBAC decision. How do you manage administrator access or elevate access to have a regular user create subscriptions, for example? You may see an example like that on the exam. Resource groups are a fundamental part or component of managing your Azure resources. They allow you to incrementally create or add resources to a container, a logical container, or remove them as you see fit, but there are limits. And as mentioned before, resource groups can't be nested. They can't be renamed. Um, you may have a question that asks you about administrative locks, for example, that we'll discuss in the next slide. Or maybe some of the things that can't be removed from a resource group or transition to another resource group, like express route circuits, for example. Some resources are global and some are regional. Understand those differences and limitations as well. Speaking of resource locks can prevent actions from being taken on resources to include either prevention of deletion or modification. A deletion lock allows you to avoid accidental disruption of your resources, uh, or you can actually choose to add a read-only lock, which would limit the ability to update that resource in any way. If I have a resource lock at a resource group level, then all of the additional or subsequently created resources within a resource group would inherit that action. So you may have a question that asks if you have a resource group for the staging app, for example, um, associated with this application, and it has a deletion lock, Are you able to move or modify any app that is created within this app service plan? We know that answer to be no, unless you modify that lock on that resource group to allow uh, that action to proceed. So, another important governance topic. Resource tags are an effective way to understand costs that span across multiple teams in Azure scopes. We understand from our learning journey that resource tags provide metadata for our Azure resources in name value pairs. There are tag limitations that you should understand in preparation for the AZ-104 exam, to include the number of characters that can live in a name for a resource tag, as well as some characters that are not that are restricted from creation of a tag. There are a certain amount of limits, a limit for how many tags can be applied to a resource. So that would be 50 in most cases, and we would think about using tags that can be added to JSON strings and manage those for Azure templates, for example. So a good question on the exam may have some context around um, maybe you have a specific web app or environments that need to be tagged with test or production, and your team would like to figure out how to make that modification. Where can you view the aggregation of those tags? Maybe cost management would be a good option, a good answer for a question that has to do with cost analysis for those tags to better understand trends. So think about ways to incorporate tags and governance into other key areas. One of those would be Azure Policy. Of course, we can use tags to manage Azure Policy. Azure Policy is a service in Azure that allows us to create, assign, and manage policies with different rules over different resources and scopes. Um, Azure Policy allows us to manage effectively policy definitions, initiatives at various levels of scope. Azure Policy also allows us to audit and enforce tags and things like naming conventions, as well as restricting the creation of a certain resource type, maybe a virtual machine of a certain size, using Azure Policy. Now let's view configuration of an Azure policy. In Azure portal, we have a view of Azure policy that allows us to author definitions, that allows us to apply and name those definitions and group those definitions, for example, with policy rules and rolling up to an initiative where we can group various policies in a container. For the exam, it may be a great idea to understand that we can also apply policy using JSON. We can find an existing policy and save the JSON or JavaScript object notation to create this policy definition with a new name and assign it to a new resource. That's absolutely doable. We're also able to use this JSON as a template in that case to maybe alter and save off and apply in a different way or to create a custom policy. That policy should require a parameter. If we're talking about tags in this JSON script, we see the tag name as a display name that has to be filled out before the actual resource that we are applying the policy to can be created. And speaking of applying policy, we've talked a little bit about various scopes, and configuring management groups allows us to provide organizational alignment for Azure subscriptions through custom hierarchies and groupings. Management groups also allow us to target policies and spend budgets across subscriptions, and there's inheritance from the hierarchy above down. We also support compliance and cost reporting by using optional management groups. Again, I mentioned that management groups have a default tier, a root management group that can't be changed but is optional to use. That might be important to remember for the exam. Management groups have various levels of scope where we can apply policy across subscriptions, with the members of each group being a subscription or one or more subscriptions, and leveled or nested between various management groups. So a management group gives us a way to organize subscriptions in our organization and to help with policy. If your organization has many subscriptions, you may need a way to efficiently manage access, compliance for those subscriptions, and management groups allow us to trust the same Azure Active Directory tenant to enforce policies at various levels and scopes to include subscriptions and inheritance down. We touched on cost management and tagging, and budgets in cost management help us plan for and drive organizational accountability within Azure. So, as from our previous example, we discussed having tags allow cost resource specific logging of consumption essentially. And we should remember that costs are resource specific. We talk about cost management, we're thinking about how we use costs between various locations or for data transfer activity. How we can think about maybe prepaying using Azure Reserve instances to reduce our costs, and thinking about using existing license purchases that would help enable our cost management by using a hybrid benefit from our on-premises licenses that we've already acquired. We can use cost management to, for example, use the tags that we previously applied to our environment and view trends so that we don't exceed our budgets, and use Azure Advisor to take advantage of recommendations to reduce those trends. So important to also remember that we have options to manage our resources with alerts and recommendations, as well as scaling our activities to reduce the spend for our budgets. Now let's check our preparedness with some practice questions. You will see exam questions of several types. One of those question types will be multiple choice. The objective domain question and answer options for you as an exam taker may look like this. Question number one, you tried to deploy a virtual machine and received an error. Code equals operation not allowed. Message equal operation results in exceeding quota limits of core. Which of the following permissions, following the principle of least privilege, would enable you to fix the error? Choose one answer. Number one, Microsoft.support /star. Number two, Microsoft.consumption /star. Number three, Microsoft.support /read. Or number four, Microsoft.compute /star. The correct answer is Microsoft.support /star. If we have a scenario where we've exceeded or are approaching our quota for a subscription, we have the ability to contact support and open a support ticket to create an increase in the number of cores that we have in our subscription. Question number two, which of the following actions are allowed by the role displayed above? Number one, open a support ticket. Number two, get the month's invoice. Number three, check the status of a virtual machine. Or number four, read the activity log. The correct answer is number two, get the month's invoice. In the above text, or declarative syntax, we see options to describe that the billing reader role has access to the following permissions, which are to view or read cost management options, which give us access to get the monthly invoice. Let's review what we've just covered. In functional group 1, we reviewed licenses in Active Directory, user management to include managing scope with Azure administrative units, device settings and device identity, bulk user updates and guest accounts, role-based access control and how those roles might be different than Azure AD roles, very important. Access control with IAM, activity logs to view any of our existing creations, Azure governance and policy, applying locks and tags and groups, as well as managing subscriptions with cost management, budgets, and recommendations, and configuration of management groups. We've just reviewed functional group 1, managing Azure identities and governance. Next up is group 2, implementing and managing storage. I hope to see you there.